Welcome and thank you for joining us for Meet the Makers inside VS Code for Education. In this series, we're taking you behind the scenes to meet the team contributing to the future of VS Code for Education. My name is Adam Smeets, and I'm one of the product managers on the VS Code for EDU team at Microsoft. And today we are sitting down with Ben to explore his developer experiences and journey that shaped this powerful platform. Whether you're an educator, a student, or just passionate about technology, get ready to dive into the story of how VS Code for EDU is empowering the next generation of developers.
Hey, my name is Ben Villalobos, and I am a software engineer working on VS Code for EDU.
Can you talk to us a little bit about what does a day look like for you working at Microsoft?
Yeah, so I work remote, which is a very interesting way to work these days. It's great that as a software engineer, you can work remote, but I found that I've had to adapt my day around things that you just kind of take for granted when you're working normally. So when you work in person, right, you have a commute, you're working next to a bunch of people, and when you're working remote, it's not the same thing. You don't have a commute. So the start of my day usually starts with going for a walk and just making sure I get out and I get the feeling of, I am commuting to work in some capacity, sort of shifting. It's about like shifting my mind to prepare it to work, which is, I don't know how much this gets talked about for people who work remote, but it's totally a thing for me. So I start by going for a walk and just sort of mentally preparing myself. Okay, like what are the meetings for the day? I'll check whatever the meetings are on my phone. And usually it starts with me just getting back to people, responding to messages, checking email, and so on. And with where I'm at in my career, I'm lucky that I get to generally spend my time heads down, focused on, fixing a bug or adding a feature or writing up some documentations.
So what's something you really love about the work that you do?
Oh man, there's a lot. I just talked a little bit about, being able to just sort of focus and be heads down on a feature, on something, like being able to, take the time to really understand every aspect of what it is that I'm doing. But I think easily my favorite thing about being a software engineer is that every single day I'm learning something new. And it's not always something technical. Sometimes something that I'm learning a lot these days is how to improve my communication. How do I communicate to my team that, I worked on X, Y, and Z, and it turns out X didn't really work out so well. But also there's this B thing that I'm considering over here. And how do I tell it in such a way that not only do I say what I did, but also how do I say it in such a way that they understand? That's such an important part because I mentioned before, adding blocks to this tower is you got to do it very carefully, and everybody has to be on the same page as you do it. And so I'm learning every day, and these days I'm learning a lot about communication and making sure that everybody's in sync and everybody's on the same page, because it's just such an important part about being an engineer.
Awesome. So that's a great transition. So you've talked to us about communication as being one of these really important skill sets. Based on the experiences you've had now and in the past, are there any other skills that you think are key in being successful in the field?
Yes. The baseline is, of course, technical skills. The stuff that I learned in my first intro to computer science class is still the stuff that I'm using today. Your if statements, your for loops, your variables, they're just always there. So that's sort of the baseline. But something that I try to tell, mentees that I have, people that ask me about, like, hey, I'm thinking about computer science, is there's something called technical resilience, which is something that isn't talked about a ton, but it's being able to look at these extremely technical problems and not freak out when you're confused about everything, because I've done this long enough now that I just understand that as like, that's just how it is. You just get confused about everything. You're not supposed to know everything, but to be an engineer, you're supposed to figure it out. And part of that means, understanding how it is that you learn. I mentioned that I go for walks a lot. that's me learning that staying in the same room the entire day, focusing on something, just is not good for my mental health. And so in order to work around that, I go for walks very often. That's not something anybody told me to do. That's just something that, on observing myself at the end of the day, I feel better on days where I go for walks, and I feel worse on days where I'm just, stuck here. And, being a software engineer means like overthinking a lot of the times about like, I'm adding this component and okay, what if it breaks over here? What if it breaks over there? What if all these different scenarios happen? Which, when you're talking about mental health, a lot of problems for mental health can come from overthinking and just being stuck in your head all the time. So a skill I would say is absolutely, look into this topic of technical resilience. And there's a lot of resources out there. It's a growing topic for sure.
We have students who may be watching and are interested in a career in technology. Can you tell us maybe one of the biggest lessons that you've learned along the way so far?
Oh man, let's go with slow and steady wins the race. These topics that you're gonna learn are extremely complicated, and there are layers to them. But if you take your time and really try to learn them, not just from a sense of, I need to get the job, so I just need to learn what an integer is, but from the perspective of curiosity. If you're just genuinely curious, for example, of how an integer works, what it is, then you won't just see it as a number. You'll see it as this thing that, this thing along with its underlying components, which absolutely helps in the future when you eventually get a job, because when you take the time to learn something, it'll stick in, just how the brain works. It'll stick in your long-term memory, and understanding things and taking time to make sure that they sink will make sure that, you kind of have to see learning computer science as sort of building the foundation for the rest of everything you're going to do with it. Because computer science is, a field of study, but when you become a software engineer, eventually you're not like a programmer, you're not a computer scientist, you are a software engineer, which is a different thing, right? And the fundamentals of being a software engineer is that computer science baseline knowledge. And so, take it slow, don't rush. Make sure that before you move on to the next topic, that you really try to understand from a lens of curiosity that first thing that you learn, because everything builds on top of each other and they never stop being useful. You just always use those things. I mentioned that in my first class, I learned, arrays. I still remember how I learned arrays. That mental framework is what I still use today for how arrays work. So take your time, take it slow, and it will sink in.
I think it's also another great transition thinking about those lessons that you had about learning arrays, right? So teachers are really important and critical in helping unpack complex topics and preparing students for career, college, or even gig. So we work really closely with educators building and shaping VS Code for the EDU experience. What advice would you have for educators who are working with students who they talk about wanting to have a career in a tech or related field? What suggestions would you give for educators?
A suggestion that I would give is to make sure that students understand that, being a software engineer or even learning programming is not just the act of programming. Programming is a means to an end to make something. And that thing that you make can be anything. So for students who are interested in, fashion versus video games, those are two very different things, but both of those are totally valid. And there is somebody out there who learned computer science, who loves fashion, who found their thing and are just loving it. For me, I love education and computer science. I just happened to find my way over here, and now I'm working on something that appeals to something I'm already interested in. For the student who loves video games, there are tons of video game development companies. So a lot of it is just awareness and letting them know that, hey, whatever you're interested in, there is a way to find a project that you will end up loving. Because it's not just about the programming. Again, the programming is a means to an end. And whatever you're interested in, there is a path to get to working on something within that interest. And once you can meld those two things together, that's the dream right there.
Yeah, passion and calling, right? Like really helping students identify if they have a passion area, how can you help them arrive at what their calling might be, whether it's software engineering, design, whatever area it may be within the field. So
Absolutely.
We're reaching our last question, Ben. So for students that are watching or have questions, and they're just starting to learn about the field, brand new, just learning about it, what would be a great first step for a student that you'd recommend?
A piece of advice that I would give anybody just stepping into computer science is whatever your interests are, whether they're related to computer science or not, try to bring those with you. Because as you're learning computer science, you're going to write some programs that might seem irrelevant to you, but there are ways to make them more interesting to you. Something that I did as I was learning computer science was try to make everything about video games, because video games are what got me interested in computer science in the first place. So I had one specific program with arrays actually that, instead of just adding and deleting stuff from a shopping list, instead I thought of it as, what if this was an inventory for a video game? Okay, and then suddenly just immediately I am so much more interested in it. And again, because I was more interested in it, I was able to tackle it from curiosity. And because I tackled it from curiosity, it stuck for a longer period of time, for well over 10 years at this point. And I still use that same mental model for arrays. So if you can take some of these seemingly sort of generic computer science programs that you write, if you can try to find a way to make it appeal to you in some way based on your own interests. I don't know what those are, but you do. So if you can, again, merge those two things, merge what you're interested in along with this thing that you're learning, and it will stick so much more and it will make a lot more sense and you will be much more curious about it.
Ben, well, thank you so much again for sharing your time and experience with the Meet the Makers series. VS Code for Education, as a reminder, is a free online computer science education platform that provides an integrated curriculum, a sandbox coding environment for everyone. With zero setup, anyone can be a developer and start learning to code with VS Code, the code editor that's preferred by software development professionals around the world. We invite you to check out the links in the video description, but until our next video, thanks again for watching, and remember, when in doubt, bash it out.